I was talking to a teacher friend of mine the other day who, when he showed his geography class this common or garden coal, he was shocked when many of them didn't know what it was. But with gas fires and central heating replacing the old-fashioned coal fires, I suppose it's no wonder. But what he is now teaching them is that it was this fossil fuel that turned Britain into the world's very first industrialised nation, and one of the country's main supplies was mined in these hills either side of the Tyne and the Wear. In fact, coal has been dug in these hills for some 2,000 years, but it wasn't until the 1600s that demand really started to pick up. And it was then that the colliery owners came up against a major problem: how to transport their coal in bulk from the hills down to the rivers, where the ships were waiting to take it to places like London. Their solution not only made the age we now call the Industrial Revolution possible, it quite literally created our nation and crossed the world. The spark that became our modern age was kindled right here in the Northeast. In the next 6 programmes, we shall be looking at the story of our railways, at the far-sighted and sometimes stubborn men who were there at the birth, to the, some say, short-sighted and bloody-minded men who oversaw the demise of much of the network. And what of the next century? Are the railways as much a part of our future as they are of our past? To answer that question, we have to go right back to the very beginning.
No one knows for sure when railways first appeared in this country. What we do know is that the near 200-year history of the railway engine is not the history of railways. Railways have been here horse-hauled for several hundred years.
So we can go as far back as the Romans, can we?
We can certainly, some 2,000 years. The Greeks had a form of rutway. The Romans had similar guided rutways in their hard metal mines on the continent. It's almost certainly the case that they had them in this country too. The technology on the continent goes on to an early form of wooden paved railway in the metal mines of Germany, but certainly the 17th and early 18th century already it is commonplace to see the horse and the wagon in the countryside.
History credits the son of a wealthy Nottinghamshire coal owner with bringing the very first horse-hauled wooden railways to the northeast. It was in 1605 that Huntington Beaumont leased pits from the Bishop of Durham in the Bedlington area, and there he built 3 wooden wagonways to transport his coal down to the River Blythe. Alas, Huntington went bust. He lost a fortune, returned to Nottingham and died in penury. But the important thing to remember is that he gave the northeast an idea that was to have such a profound effect down the centuries. "300 years ago, the landscape near the rivers was sprinkled with shallow pits, many bearing imaginative names. The coal was moved out along a network of wooden wagonways. Centuries of development have obliterated most, but at New Hartley, north of the Tyne, the hedgerow running past the red spoil heap of the old Fortune pit is the best preserved wagonway route in the northeast, looking much as it must have done when laid out in the 1700s. So the coal owners must have been pretty impressed with old Huntington's ideas.
Yes, I'm sure they were, but we mustn't run away with the idea that it all happened very quickly. They would be interested, of course, in any means of bringing down their production costs and making it easier to move to the shipment point the coal that they were winning. You see, we've just walked over a very important piece of engineering, a means of crossing a river, keeping the railway relatively level, to reach the pits that were on the south side of the Brydeene Brook.
For its age, 1740-ish, it's a very impressive feat of sort of engineering.
It is. There's quite extensive earthworks, considering that in those days they had not the mechanical means that we have now, bulldozers, JCBs, etc. It was all done by hand.
And their handiwork even stretched to fine stonework, to to take the embankment over the brook, a very important early railway relic unrecognised by all but a few.
Well, that's very true, because the public footpath goes over the top. You've got all these thick bushes growing, and very few people around this area, I think, are quite aware of it.
Looking at the capital investment this must have taken up, it must have made a big hole in the pockets of the colliery owners. Must have been worth it for them.
Well, they must have thought so at the time, but in actual fact, the bridge here had a very short working life. It must have been around 25 years. So I doubt very much whether they recouped their capital.
And the number of pits in this area were quite phenomenal to our eyes anyway.
Oh yes, there was about 40 in this particular area.
Why were they so close together though?
Well, because they couldn't go terribly deep in the early days because of ventilation and drainage.
There's not much left of our wagonways. As we said, this is probably the only surviving piece. But there was a significant find a couple of years ago.
Yes, that was on the south side of the Tyne at Lambton D Pit, where in the course of some land reclamation work there, they uncovered, I think it was something like a quarter of a mile altogether of very early wooden wagonway. I mean, in my lifetime, I never ever thought, I've been studying wagonways for a long time, and I never ever thought I would see a real wagonway, brought to life almost again in that way.
After a thorough investigation, these precious remains at Lambton were covered over again to protect them for a future time when money can be found to put them in a museum. But although the 200-year-old railway only saw the light of day for a short time, it has given us a much clearer idea of how early industry was swiftly taking possession of the land. All roads lead to Rome. All wagonways led to Seaton Sluice. Well, not quite, but the ones we've been looking at anyway.
The ones we've been looking at today, yes, they run down here to this harbour.
Built, what, 1660?
Yes, by Delaval, and it was, obviously it's a river mouth, but it was opened out to take collier barks.
An interesting thing I find, Alan in particular, is that hill over there.
Yes, yeah. It represents the ballast which the empty ships were loaded with on their return journey before they in turn were loaded with coal to go south again. So this is all come quite a long way from the London area.
So that's a little bit of the south in the north.
Yes, indeed, yes. Yeah.
Well, now, very quickly, this became inadequate.
Yes, it had problems of silting up, hence its name of Seaton Sluice, because there had been a sluice which was used to wash out the silt. You can see how the harbour mouth is very, very narrow. It's like an elongated S. And the collier brigs had considerable difficulty in getting both in and out of the harbour. Could wait as much as 3 weeks to come in. Yes, if the weather conditions weren't right. They had to have tide and wind absolutely right. Obviously, this was something which colliery owners couldn't tolerate because it was tying up their equipment for no good purpose. You want a boat to come in and start loading straight away.
It was bad planning, wasn't it?
Well, not so much planning. I think they were using the lay of the land. So man had to come into it again and find a solution, as they always do in cases like this. It took the right Delaval to come along. It needed a man full of dynamism and energy to bring it about. But he saw the solution as being the construction of something which would enable the boats to avoid this difficult entrance.
That solution in 1761 was both bold and spectacular. A great chasm cut through the rock to allow the collier brigs to berth regardless of the weather. Good grief. Absolutely extraordinary. Must have been a formidable task to cut all this out of the rock.
Oh, must have been, yes.
Because they literally just cut the headland off.
Yes, but then when you think about it, I mean, pit sinking was quite an art, and they had men with the knowledge of cutting stone, I'm sure. And we said a moment ago that it could take up to 3 weeks to get the ship in. With this method, it was 2 days later, the ship was out again with its load. So that's a very considerable saving on the previous method.
So how exactly did it work? Ships presumably came in up this way, did they, facing this way?
Winched in most probably, and came up and berthed alongside the chutes which are built into the stone wall on the right hand side here, and then they would proceed to load up with the coal, which was fed from the collieries and stored. There would be numerous sidings on the top here. There just wouldn't be a single line from a colliery to and then back again. And then once the collier was loaded, it would be winched or manhandled back down through the opening out to sea again, and away it would go. And then the next one would come in. The process would be repeated.
A wagonway port. So what?
Yes, a wagonway port.
What finally killed it then?
Well, really it was the coming of the railways and the fact that the railways could move so much more coal more expeditiously, and to points where, of course, they didn't have the problems that existed at these small places like Cullercoats and the cut here at Seaton Sluice, which clearly had very considerable limitations.
So, hand on heart, how crucial are the wagonways and places like this to our story?
Well, they're absolutely vital because they were the first stepping stone in the route that brought us to a very modern railway system all over this country.
The 1700s were very much the era of the wagonways. The railways, as we know them, were still 3 generations into the future. Seaton Sluice is very much a monument to that era, but there's an even more impressive monument south of the Tyne that's famous throughout the world. If there's one icon to the age of horse-drawn wagonways, it's Causey Arch in County Durham. In the early 1700s, when it carried a busy line across the deep valley, it was the wonder of the age. Even today, its sheer scale hints at the extraordinary developments which exactly a century later would evolve into the very first modern railway. Andy, I mean, what, nearly 300 years after it was built, Causey Arch here just still takes your breath away.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? When you think that this in 1725 was more or less a Millennium Dome and Channel Tunnel rolled into one piece of architecture.
It's an astonishing thought that this is a great work of civil engineering. The previous great work, of course, was Hadrian's Wall, what, more than 1,500 years beforehand?
Yes. This is the first great piece of, if you like, modern civil engineering work. It was the longest single-span bridge for over 30 years. Quite medieval in its architecture, but its use absolutely modern for a wooden wagonway, and that's what makes it so exceptional.
£2,225 to build.
That's right. It's just over 100 foot span, and it's still there. The actual mason of the bridge was a chap called Ralph Wood, a local man. Legend has it that the first bridge collapsed, and he was so worried when they were constructing this great second bridge that before it was completed he threw himself off.
A nice story, but...
Like all the best stories, it's not true, but it is a great story.
But nevertheless, it is such an astonishing piece of work. Who put the money up for it?
Well, it was a group of colliery owners, lessees, landowners called the Grand Allies, who were going to have a huge impact on the colliery industry. And they combined all their money and their energy and their influence. They were the Liddell family, the Wortleys and the Bowes, all influential groups. But by coming together, they could be really 10 times as effective rather than 3 times. And it allowed them to enforce the way-leave agreements that they needed to get their coal to market.
So in other words, it gave them more muscle to push through land where they wanted to go.
This was corporate coal extraction rather than back garden coal extraction. This is the start of the large, great company. By combining, they can be more effective than they can individually.
A hint of things to come for the coal industry.
Absolutely.
And of course, we mustn't forget either, this in its day was the longest wagonway in the world.
It was, yes, an extraordinary feat of engineering, really, from one end to the other.
In fact, the arch isn't the only engineering gem at Causey. A few yards along the wagonway, the line had to cross the valley again. Only here, the solution was a huge bank, 100 feet high and 300 feet broad at the base, with a stone culvert to take the beck.
In fact, what we're standing on is the edge of the world's first great railway embankment.
I mean, looking at the height of it, Andy, it must have taken months, if not years, to build.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's over 100 foot high. The JCB of the early 1700s with a man with a spade and a wheelbarrow.
So nothing but sweat went into it.
Absolutely, yes. It's an extraordinary thing to attempt. What's happened is they've come round the edge of the valley and they've hit another great big chasm, as it were. And this time it's too wide for a bridge, so they've had to fill it in.
Amazing. And it brought people from, well, a long way away to see it.
It was an international sensation, perhaps is a bit too much, but it was pretty close. This size of earthworking as civil engineering was just extraordinary at the time. Quite incredible. And people did come from all over Europe, and they were amazed that not just it had been done, but done for something like a wagon way.
The one fact that makes these hugely expensive engineering works cost-effective, as we'd say, is that 60% of the coal being exported through the Tyne was being mined in this area around Tanfield. We're moving towards the end of the 1700s now. Demand for coal is hotting up. The old pits near the river were becoming exhausted, and the colliery owners were having to dig new ones further and further and further away from the rivers. The pace was quickening. The coal brought in other industries. Salt, lead, soap and glass were all being exported. The northeast was starting to flourish. As the century turned, Britain's world lead in the Industrial Revolution was firmly established. It was here at Ironbridge in Shropshire in 1709 that a man called Abraham Darby successfully smelted iron using coke and not charcoal. This made production much cheaper and made this the world's very first iron bridge possible. But it also attracted a young Cornish engineer, Richard Trevithick, whose arrival here was to have a profound effect 200 miles away in the northeast. So tell me, John, why did Trevithick travel all the way up the country to Coalbrookdale?
Well, Coalbrookdale was the centre of the iron industry in this country. It's where all the major innovations had taken place. And right back in the 1720s, they'd made the first cast iron cylinders for steam engines. This is where it all began.
So really, at the time, this was the world's industrial hotspot.
It was the centre for iron-making technology, and there's a whole list of firsts that can be attributed to the Shropshire iron industry, and Trevithick's locomotive was one of the most famous.
More of that later, but what was he like as a man? I mean, he was known in his day as the Cornish giant.
Well, he was a giant. He was 6'2". He was involved in a bit of Cornish wrestling. But he was a real sort of visionary, wasn't really a businessman. And what he saw was the possibility or the capacity for using high-pressure steam. I mean, steam engines at that time were literally as big as a house. By using high-pressure steam, he saw he could make compact, small steam engines. And having done that, he suddenly thought, well, we can put them on wheels. He saw the possibility of using them for transport.
Which he did in Cornwall, but it failed, didn't it?
Well, it sort of worked. He made a little road carriage, and there's a famous story about they successfully went up Camborne Hill. Somebody wrote a song about it. They all went into the pub to celebrate, and it promptly blew up. So that was his first attempt. His second attempt was the one that brought him to back up here to Shropshire. And we'd got one thing that Cornwall hadn't, which was an extensive railway network, obviously horse-drawn. I mean, they'd produced the first iron rails back in 1767, so there was this sort of nice private test track he could use. And Coalbrookdale, the ironworks, was extremely receptive to these sort of imaginative, innovative ideas, and then we think they actually funded the project and then built an engine to run on the rails.
So there she is. She's making some very strange noises.
It's got a very unique sound. It's only got one cylinder, which gives it a really good strong chuff, which of course goes straight up the chimney, which is one of Trevithick's sort of innovations.
Funny looking little thing, isn't she? So, John, was she a success?
Well, we don't really know. We know it was built. There's a drawing in the Science Museum, and there's a lot of references to it. It all then goes rather quiet. So what we think is it was built, but wasn't too successful.
Why not? I mean, what did he do wrong?
Well, you've got to imagine this is a prototype. I mean, nobody's built a locomotive before, so it was like everything. You made mistakes. I mean, one problem might have been actually that the size of it. I mean, everything is crammed into that cylinder. I mean, the boiler is actually a cast iron cylinder. Yeah. It was one of the reasons he came here. But of course, that restricts all the dimensions. So it wasn't. I don't think it would have been a very good steam producer.
But he did go on, though, didn't he? He can't have been that disheartened.
Oh no, I mean, it's like he must have seen the possibilities, seen where it was going wrong, and of course his next engine at Penydarren was a lot bigger, with a lot more volume of steam in, and as we know, that actually ran successfully, won the 500 guinea bet that was made, and that's the one that gets all the prominence in the history books, but this was like step number one.
Right, and step number 3, which is the important one to us, was at Gateshead.
That's right, and every one was a progression. He learned from the mistakes, and I mean, there's some fundamental mistakes with this when you look at it as a running engine, and that the firebox is under the cylinder, which sounds great until you actually think about it. You can't actually fire this on the move without getting a parting down the middle of your head. So there are several mistakes like that built into it.
But the strange thing is that he actually lost interest. He did Catch Me Who Can, which was a little engine that ran in London.
He never really had the backer, and everything he tried was great and it was wonderfully exciting, but always beset with some disaster. Things blew up, wheels fell off. You know, he built more road carriages, and Catch Me Who Can was the classic last effort, if you like. He sat there and ran it almost as a fairground ride in Euston Square, and then the wheel fell off and everybody went, oh dear, and it all went to pieces, and he lost heart, and then he disappears over to South America and sort of embarks on new adventures there.
And dies in poverty.
And dies in poverty and sort of gets forgotten a little bit in the history books.
Such a shame for such a great man.
It is, yeah. Well, we're doing our best with this really, sort of get his name up in prominence again.
We're now approaching one of those key points in history upon which so much of the future hinges. The stage was set, the main players were waiting in the wings, but the curtain was yet to rise. All that was needed was a jolt, a nudge, and it came from the most unexpected direction. Napoleon, at the head of his army, was tearing the heart out of Europe. The insatiable demand for horses and feed meant that in Britain, prices were going through the roof, and that was hitting the colliery owners with their horse-hauled wagonways where it hurt most, in the pocket. Hay was expensive and scarce. Coal, on the other hand, was plentiful and free. They all agreed what they needed most of all was a horse that ate coal, and Richard Trevithick's little engine here at Coalbrookdale was the answer to their prayers. In the early years of the 1800s, war was laying waste to much of Europe, but its effects were spreading far beyond the battlegrounds. One of the more unusual consequences was becoming a threat to the rapidly expanding coalfields in the northeast. Up until now, the colliery owners had used horses exclusively to transport their coal from their pits down to the rivers. But thousands of horses were being killed in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and that meant that in Britain they were becoming extremely scarce. And that in turn meant that the colliery owners were having to pay vastly more for both horses and their feed. Their solution was both logical and, at first glance, an impossibility. What they needed was a horse that ate coal. I wonder how many of the thousands of passengers who daily travel over High Level Bridge in Newcastle realise that they're passing very near the spot where railway history was made. In the early 1800s, the Winfield Foundry stood here, and it was here that the very first steam locomotive in the northeast was built. The Gateshead engine, as it's known, was constructed to a design by Richard Trevithick. It was very similar to one he built 3 years earlier at Coalbrookdale in Shropshire. Now, it's a great tragedy this little engine did not survive, but there is something still in existence which provides us with a direct link with this hugely important locomotive. So, Jim, you found this in a scrapyard at Bishop Auckland, but it's the one thing we have to connect us with that little engine.
That's right. Winfield's Foundry was the place Not only that this little safe was made in 1813, that magic year of railway innovation, but it was actually produced by that engine. It was built at Winfield by John Steele. John Steele was the first great railway engineer the region knew. He'd worked with Trevithick in Wales and at Coalbrookdale, had worked on his earliest engines, and it was him that came back and said, you, Mr. Winfield, have got the agency for Trevithick engines in the northeast. Let's not just do stationary ones, let's build a high-pressure one. So he built a high-pressure engine, but it was a speculative build, and the one man who was most interested and possibly going to buy it was Blackett, Christopher Blackett at Wylam. He came along, he saw it run up and down the yard, he said, very interesting, I'll think about this. But he didn't actually buy it. The engine had its wheels taken off, it was set to work blowing the foundry cupola, and it actually smelted down this very metal.
Christopher Blackett was the squire at Wylam. His family had bought the village just a few miles west of Newcastle in the 1600s. Coal had been mined here for at least 900 years. In 1748, the family had laid a wooden wagonway from the riverside colliery 5 miles downstream to Staithes at Leamington, and in 1800, businessman Christopher saw the possibilities and began to look around for ways to develop the family coal business. Slowly but surely, vital elements were coming together to turn Wylam into a crucible of change. So really, Philip, this pit heap is just about the only substantial remains left of the colliery.
That's right, everything else has disappeared. The colliery closed in 1868 and everything was removed, but obviously the trees have grown over this in the last 130 years.
Of course, we have to say that the real reason for us being here is not to talk about the colliery, but to meet two more of the main players in our story.
Yes, William Headley, the colliery manager at Wylam, and Timothy Hackworth, who was the former of the colliery blacksmiths, were both key figures in the history of locomotive development.
In what way?
It was Headley who came to Wylam in 1804, who later developed Puffing Billy and Wylam Dilly, which are now the two oldest locomotives in the world. And he worked with Timothy Hackworth, who of course was another famous railway engineer in northeast history. He was a very practical man. This was his important contribution there. His father had been the colliery blacksmith and he succeeded to that role, and he had tremendous skills in developing the engineering techniques and working with metals.
We haven't talked a lot about Headley, but he was still a very important figure.
I think a very important man. He is very much overshadowed, unfortunately, by George Stephenson. Tyneside, I think, took to Stephenson and were Geordie mad, if you like, and Headley was rather left out of the picture. But Headley was, again, a very clever man. He trained as colliery viewer and colliery manager. After leaving Wylam in the 1820s, he subsequently acquired shipping interests and colliery interests, quite large colliery interests in Durham, and when he died, he was a very wealthy man.
So really we had Hackworth, Headley, Blackett and Stephenson, all clever men in their own right. What was special about Wylam to make it happen here?
That, I think, is the $64,000 question. I don't know that anybody has the real answer. It is just one of those unique coincidences, I think, that Wylam provided 3 or 4 of the most important figures in early railway history. Perhaps it's something special in the local chemistry.
So really, Philip, any lover of railways from wherever they come in the world would sooner or later have to come here.
Yes, this is very much the Mecca to which all true railway enthusiasts would want to come. This was the birthplace of George Stephenson, popularly known as the father of railways.
And the extraordinary thing is, though, Philip, that small as it is to our eyes, there were 4 families living here.
That's right, and the Stephenson family lived in one ground floor room. There were the 2 parents and certainly 4 of their 6 children were born in Wylam.
A whole family lived just in this one room.
Yes, I think we'd regard it as severe overcrowding if we had that number of children today living in a room of this size. Very much a slum.
Now, he was the second child in the family, wasn't he? Tell me the story of his early years.
Yes, he was born in 1781 and he spent his first few years of his life in Wylam. We don't know a great deal about what happened then. but I think one of the things he would do would be involved in going down to the pit in the village where his father worked as the colliery fireman, taking his lunch, probably helping to keep his younger brothers and sisters from running onto the nearby wagonway. He would have certainly have seen the horses drawing the wagons loaded with coal past the front door.
So young George, coming from a very humble family, would have been destined for a very humble life.
Yes, normally somebody in his position would have had very few career prospects, and certainly his father earned very little, only about 12 shillings a week, which is 40 pence in modern currency. But and he, of course, the difficulty was that the family were so poor that none of the children had any formal education, and it was only when George was 18 or so that he actually was able to go to night school at his own expense and start to learn to read and write.
That shows incredible determination.
Yes, this is, to my mind, one of the great qualities of Stevenson. It was his determination and his self-help. Some people regard him perhaps slightly arrogant at times, but he had this tremendous drive and enthusiasm, I think, which brought success in its end. But it was when they moved from Wylam in 1789 that the family went to Throckley, or near Throckley, when his father got a job at another of the local pits, that George started to become more interested in the mechanical side of engines, the pumping engines associated with the pits.
Which obviously was a curtain raiser for his later work on locomotives.
Absolutely.
So you think he does deserve to be called father of the railways, even though he may have stolen, borrowed other people's ideas?
I don't think there's anyone else to whom that title could be given more effectively. I think Stevenson, he didn't invent the locomotive. That clearly was Richard Trevithick. There were aspects of locomotive development itself which he was not involved with, but he was largely responsible for having the foresight to extend the railway network and using railways as an important means of transport.
Stevenson's greatness is beyond question, but a growing number of people believe we need to readjust our perspective of him. Jim, we've heard an awful lot about George Stephenson. Does he really deserve all the credit?
No, not all the credit at all. But as you say, the story has become one of Stevenson. Stevenson's story is intertwined with it and was from a very early date. One of the biggest problems we have as historians is that by the middle of the last century, shortly after Stevenson's death, he was already being seen as the father of all railways, the inventor of every aspect of the railway engine. And that has meant that not only have people recorded more about Stephenson himself, they've saved his engines.
So who should we be lifting our hats to?
No single person. Trevithick certainly as the first person to really get the idea of a steam engine on rails. But beyond that, a whole group of people, almost all of them in the northeast. Those who weren't in the northeast were either from the northeast or working for people in the northeast. It is a very, very tight Tyneside development. And this process of writing the history round the survivals is a terrible mistake. We should be careful not to drop into that, particularly when those survivals, such as Stephenson engines, are already being chosen very early on in the last century as icons to the future.
You're not very fond of Stephenson, are you?
I think he does himself no favours looking back into history at being a man who could so easily, at the height of his success and fame, have turned around and said, yes, but there were others and they deserve remembering. Instead, he just nodded and said, gosh, it was nothing. I did it all.
In 1881, this oak tree was planted to commemorate the centenary of George's birth. And you know the saying, from little acorns, great oaks grow. Well, the seeds of the railways had been well and truly planted here at Wylam, and now they were beginning to sprout. Hundreds of vehicles thunder along this busy road through Killingworth on North Tyneside every day, but I wonder how many of the drivers spare a glance at this rather pretty little stone building. Our story now moves here to Dial Cottage, where the Stevenson family moved in 1804. It's actually alleged that George himself made that sundial. But we do know for a fact that in 1812, George was appointed engine wright to the colliery just behind this cottage. And in 1814, with his newfound knowledge and with an eye to what Headley and Hackworth were doing over at Wylam, he persuaded colliery manager Nicholas Wood to allow him to build a locomotive. It was called the Blucher, and it's widely accepted now that it was the first modern type engine.
Blucher outshone all its contemporaries. It could pull 30 tons uphill at 4 miles an hour. As it was said at the time, it was worth 50 horses.
We now come to one of those most crucial moments upon which all our history hinges, and it happened here, in this building in Darlington. It was once the grand home of Edward Pease, a wool merchant and a Quaker, and one of the main backers of plans to build a horse-hauled railway some 40-odd miles from the West Durham coalfield down to the River Tees at Stockton.
Stevenson and Wood, by now convinced that steam locomotives were the key to the future, caught the mail coach to Stockton. The story goes that they walked the 12 miles to Darlington, arriving muddy, tired, and looking for all the world like common labourers. They knocked at Edward Pease's door and came within a whisker of being turned away. But fate had other ideas.
It was this day Edward Pease found himself alone in his house, except for a manservant, and like often a married man, busy man, when he gets all his family safely out of the way, he's started to catch up with all his correspondence. There he was writing letters, and he had the one manservant came, there'd been this knock on the door, from this very door here, and the manservant came up to say, "Mr. Pease, there are two gentlemen who wish to speak to you." They say they have some might be of interest to you. First of all, he's saying, "I'm not expecting anybody." No, but he was a devout Quaker. The Lord may have sent these men to me for a special purpose. And so they were shown into the kitchen, and they sat round the table, and the outcome was they were from Killingworth Colliery, a Mr. Nicholas Wood and a Mr. George Stevenson.
So Stevenson and Wood were invited in by the manservant and made to wait in this very room.
And Edward Pease came down to talk to them, ask what their business was. They immediately went into his business about these plans for a horse-drawn tramway from his collieries to the northwest of Darlington down to the navigable part of the Tees. And they then asked him if he'd be interested in coming to Killingworth Colliery to see this steam engine which could pull many times the load of a horse.
Well, now, I know this is the story of a locksmith's shop now, but we really can't overestimate the importance in terms of railway history that happened on this very spot. It was crucial, wasn't it?
So much happened as a result of that conversation. The Stockton-Darlington Railway opening, and then a little while after that, Joseph Pease, Edward's son, connected Newcastle to York through Darlington, and then the line spread out over the country.
After this meeting, Pease wrote to his cousin Thomas Richardson the following letter, which conveys so strongly the excitement that he felt. "Dear cousin, we should get forward as quick as George Stevenson speaks of, completing the job in 18 months from first opening our ground, and this we expect will be ere this year close. The more we see of Stevenson, the person Gordon names, the more we are pleased with him. He commences the setting out of the line in a few days. He's altogether a self-taught genius, a man thee would be remarkably pleased. Don't be surprised if I tell thee, there seems to us, after careful examination, no difficulty of laying a railroad from London and to Edinburgh, on which wagons would travel and take the mail at the rate of 20 miles per hour. From all this judicious man says, and all we can yet see, no doubt has yet entered my mind, but we shall make a good thing of this concern."
Up to now, the wagonways had used a variety of gauges, that's the distance between the rails. But now Chief Engineer Stevenson had to decide on a gauge for his new Stockton to Darlington railway line. There's an enduring story that he came here to the Roman fort at Housteads on Hadrian's Wall to measure the ancient wheel ruts in the East Gate. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the Romans had trains. These ruts were made by the wheels of ancient carts, and lo and behold, they still measure to an average of 4 feet 8.5 inches, and that eventually became standard gauge for all railways throughout the world. Whatever the truth of the story, it is a fact that in 1823, Pease joined with George Stephenson's son Robert and Bedlington Ironworks owner Michael Longridge to form a company to build steam engines. They constructed workshops at 4th Street in Newcastle, the very first locomotive works in the world.
They were founded on the 23rd of June 1823. George's 19-year-old son Robert became the first working manager. This drawing is the only remaining record of what the works looked like. Today there's little left beyond this window. But it was in this building that two of the most famous early locomotives in the world were built, Locomotion No. 1 and Rocket. And such was the success of those pioneering days that the works swiftly expanded into other buildings in 4th Street.
Well, these were once the offices of the Robert Stephenson and Company works here in 4th Street in Newcastle. And this is a hammer that was actually used in these works in the 1830s. You can still see the logo of the company on the head. It's actually a family treasure, and it belongs to the great-great-grandson of George's brother John, and that's Robert Stephenson Roper. That's been in the family some time then, obviously.
It has, yes.
Was it passed down to you, or did you just find it, or what?
Well, it was inherited from my father and I suppose from his grandmother.
It must be quite something for you to come to this building and know that your great-great-grandfather and Robert must have walked around these very rooms.
Yes, it is indeed, yes, certainly.
So was Robert much like his father George, Bob?
No, I think he was more of an inventor, a greater inventor than his father, and of course he was a greater civil engineer than his father was.
Yeah, of course, we mustn't forget that Robert also built bridges, not just locomotives.
Yes, true. He was a great bridge builder. In fact, many people remember his bridges rather than anything else that he did.
Events were gathering momentum. Work had begun laying the first rails for the new Stockton-Darlington line. George Stephenson had moved on to survey other railways. Robert was in South America. So Timothy Hackworth, in 1824, had been brought in as manager. At the time, hills were a huge obstacle. Locomotives were simply not powerful enough to haul trains up, and tunnels were too costly. The solution was well tried and tested: an overhead winding drum to pull the trucks up one side and lower them down the other.
And indeed, that's what this is at Brusselton, just to the west of Shildon, a conventional rope-hauled incline. In fact, you can still see the old stone sleeper blocks that carried the rails. But down there to the east, on the edge of town, convention ended. If there's anywhere where you could argue that our modern age began, it would have to be here on this footpath through the heart of Shildon. For this used to be the track bed of what we now call the Stockton and Darlington Railway. And it was from this very spot that locomotion set off on that September day all those years ago.
On the morning of the 25th of September 1825, locomotion pulled away, with George Stephenson himself at the controls. Edward Pease wasn't there. His son had died the night before. Locomotion hauled 6 wagons of coal and merchandise, 6 passenger wagons, 14 for workmen, and the company coach for the committee. 2 hours and 9 miles later, she chuffed into Darlington, having achieved an average speed of 8 miles an hour. The 300 on board had swelled to 600, and in Darlington, 12,000 had turned out to welcome her. At 3:45 that afternoon, the train reached Stockton, to be met by 40,000.
For the first time in history, a steam locomotive had hauled passengers on a public railway. I often wonder if George Stephenson and the other pioneers realised what they'd started and how, from this moment on, the world would never be the same again. So far, in our epic story of the railways, we've met many outstanding men and their pioneering machines. But many believe the man who contributed more than most has been largely eclipsed by the Stephensons. We've already met Timothy Hackworth at Wylam, but now Hackworth and the Stephensons were to find themselves at loggerheads. And it was this funny little engine called sans pareil, or without parallel, that was largely to blame.
One commentator wrote in 1830, Hackworth is improving the locomotive as no other man is doing, and is in advance of Stephenson. Hardly any two of Hackworth's locomotives are alike. Stephenson, while getting hold of a good idea, repeats it over again.
Jane, does that summarise your great-great-grandfather?
Yes, it does. He had gained so much experience in mechanical engineering, different modes of doing things from the time that he lived at Wylam until he settled here at Soho House in Shildon. And we're actually sitting in his parlour now.
Must be quite interesting for you to sit where he sat all those years ago.
Yes, it is. And he had a very good life here with his family. He was very much a family man, and that was very important to him.
You spent years researching the family history. The man himself must have emerged from your work.
He's a very compassionate man, and he loved family life. He became a Methodist in 1814 at Wylam, and in fact refused to work on a Sunday, and because of that had to leave Wylam. And in a way, that is why we are sitting here, because if he had stayed at Wylam all his life, history would have been very different.
So it kind of propelled him into a new phase of life.
It did, because he went from there to Walbottle and worked on stationary engines, and then, of course, was asked by George Stephenson to go and work at the Fourth Street Works in 1824 when locomotion was being built. And subsequently, the directors of the Stockton Darlington Railway asked him to come to Shildon.
So do you think that he and Stephenson were friends, or was it more of a working relationship, sort of at arm's length?
They'd known each other since they were small boys. They had both come from Wylam, and certainly when the Puffing Billies and Wylam Dillies were being built, and Hackworth was of course foreman of the Smiths, George Stephenson often went round to see what was happening there. I think that they rubbed along quite well, but I think perhaps Hackworth had reservations about George Stephenson, and perhaps that is why when he was first asked to come as superintendent engineer of the Stockton Darlington Railway, he actually prevaricated. It took some persuasion, and he was offered a house, this house in which we are sitting, and £150 a year. But he did prevail upon the directors to allow him to also build locomotives in his own right, which he did here.
You must feel a bit aggrieved that Stephenson got all the credit.
Well, when I was a child, we used to be very angry, my father and I, who was also an engineer, about that he hadn't received the credit he deserved. But things have changed amazingly. More and more people are going back to original documents and then looking more and more at what each one of the pioneers did to contribute to the railway system. But Hackworth probably introduced more innovations in the early steam locomotives than anyone else. He would get one and something wouldn't quite work, so he would try something else. It might be the plugs, it might be the springs, it might be the cylinders. He tried everything, and gradually something evolved which was really workable. And of course he built in 1827 the Royal George, which was probably the most important real early locomotive.
In what way? Why is she so important?
The Royal George was very important because at that time, in 1827, the directors of the Stockton and Darlington Railway were considering going back to the use of horses only, because the 4 Stephenson locomotives kept breaking down and were very costly. So Hackworth said, give me the chance to build a locomotive that will prove once and for all the supremacy of steam power over horsepower. And he built the Royal George, and actually could pull weights at half the cost of using horses. And steam locomotion was there forever.
Built in 1827, Royal George the locomotive summed up Hackworth the man. It was reliable, it was more than capable of doing the job for which it was constructed, and it was a big improvement on its contemporaries.
Well, now this building is very special in every way because it was Timothy's own baby, wasn't it?
Yes, this was one part of his own Soho works. He started to build up his Soho works while still running the Stockton-Darlington works during the day. But he wanted to build locomotives in his own right, and in 1836 he was asked by the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas, to build a locomotive for Russia. It was a locomotive to pull the first passenger train in Russia, and it was a really very exciting time for him.
That means his reputation had spread beyond Children and beyond England. He must have been a well-known man by then.
Yes, in fact, the Tsar's sons came over to Wylam in the very early days and were looking then at what was being done in England. And I think it's through that Hackworth got an order. The Stephensons also got an order, but Hackworth's locomotive was the first in Russia.
Hackworth's business card hints at his successes in the 1830s, but it hadn't always been so. In the 1820s, many were simply not convinced that locomotives were the future. Engineering was in its infancy and breakdowns were commonplace. In 1829, the directors of Britain's first intercity passenger line between Liverpool and Manchester decided to hold a competition to find the most reliable and efficient locomotive. First prize, £500. The Rainhill trials on October the 6th, 1829 have gone down in the annals as one of the greatest events in railway history. 10 engines were entered, 5 turned up, 2 withdrew, leaving Robert Stephenson's Rocket, the favourite Novelty, and Timothy Hackworth's Sans Pareil, which incredibly he designed and built in his spare time.
He had to do the work wherever he could, probably in the house. Poor Mrs. Hackworth, I'm sure she had something to say about it. And he had to contract out for various parts of the locomotive to be built. It's quite interesting, actually, if you look at the Sans Pareil, because it's only a 4-wheel locomotive, while the Royal George, which was 2 years before, was 6 wheels. So, you know, he could only do it in a sort of kind of limited way. But he built it, and he had various parts made at the Stephenson Works at 4th Street, Newcastle. And once again, it's the old story of these dratted cylinders. Because, first of all, George Stephenson had really laid down the rules for the competition for Liverpool-Manchester Railway. And when the Sans Pareil arrived for the trials, it was decreed to be too heavy. Well, you know, I think the rules were changed rather to suit the Stephenson camp. But it was allowed to steam, and in one of the trials, the cylinder blew. It, in fact, achieved faster speed originally than the Rocket. And also, after the trials, the Rocket only ran for a year or so, while the original Sans Pareil went on first as a locomotive and then was converted to a stationary engine and went on working until 1864.
So do you smell a rat? Do you think there was conspiracy against her?
There's always been the great thing. I actually don't think there probably was. I do think it was an inexact science. I do think that Stephenson was pretty determined for the Rocket to really do well. But I think the actual case of the cylinder was just, it was such a difficult job. And you know, the Russian story, it's a few years later and the same problem arose, and it arose on a lot of the early locomotives.
Now, I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. At Rainhill, comparing Hackworth and Stephenson, who was the worthy winner?
It's quite interesting, actually, because I'm going to be a little more controversial than that, because actually George Stephenson didn't build the Rocket. It was his son, Robert Stephenson, which I think is very important, Robert Stephenson and Co., with Booth, who actually had quite a lot to do with the boiler. But I think probably the rocket actually was too light for the job and didn't run successfully afterwards, while the Sempre did run successfully afterwards. And I think we have to leave it therefore to other people to say which was the most successful locomotive.
Will you tell me?
Well,
what,
it's the
was
proof
this
of
the better
pudding.
locomotive?
The proof of the pudding is in the eating. And this locomotive ran for many, many years, while the rocket did not.
Well, as every schoolboy knows, the winner at Rainhill was the rocket. But was she a worthy winner? Well, by happy coincidence, she's at the National Railway Museum in York undergoing a thorough examination.
First of all, that is 13.
Well, Michael, this is what's left of the old girl herself. What are you doing to her?
Well, we're trying to find out rather more about Rocket than has hitherto been understood. We're looking at the locomotive in minute detail, trying to establish what modifications were made during her working life, and indeed what modifications were made during her time at the Science Museum.
Well, was she a worthy winner at Rainhill then?
Oh, very much so. Rocket was one of a series of prototype locomotives which Robert Stevenson and his team at Newcastle developed specifically for mainline service on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. They had managed to develop the locomotive to this point by the time of the Rainhill trials. But of course there was a lot more development to take place even after Rocket, and she was pretty well out of date straight away because they learned so much as a result of Rainhill itself.
But of course she became, and still is, the most famous locomotive in the world.
Yes, indeed she is, that's right. And quite rightly so, of course, because she represents so much of the specific endeavours of Robert Stevenson and his team to create a locomotive worthy of mainline operation.
The National Railway Museum here in York is home to this great locomotive. She's the last steam engine ever built by British Rail in 1960. It's a testament to Stevenson that the techniques he used to build Rocket were used in the construction of the Evening Star 131 years later. This is the churchyard at Scrayingham near York, and it contains the grave of a man who was at first hailed as the railway king and later damned as a drunken, greedy, bloated blackguard. In the 1830s, railways were exploding all over the country, and here lies George Hudson, who saw the opportunities unfolding before his eyes and decided to cash in.
George Hudson was born in 1800, the fifth son of a yeoman farmer. He started his working life as a draper's assistant and would have been consigned to obscurity but for a windfall of £30,000, left to him by a distant great-uncle. In those days it was a fortune, and it elevated him to the best circles, making friends with the right sort of people. He became a young Tory, and in 1834 met George Stephenson himself while on holiday in Whitby. Stephenson fired his imagination with the idea of a network of railways covering Britain. And it was around this time Hudson coined his maxim, for which he still remembered: "To make all railways come to York." And his dream came true in York's first railway station, now hidden away amongst later buildings.
So his dream did come true in a very grand style, Stuart.
Yes, it certainly did. The building here was built in 1841 and is effectively a lasting memorial to him. It was really built in a grand style, and I'm sure he designed it that way and got the best architect, Andrews, in order to emphasise his strength and his power base.
So it's more of a monument to the man than a railway station.
Yes, but there was another reason why it was built so grandly and solidly. At that time, people were genuinely quite frightened of travelling at the speeds on the train, and therefore a lot of the stations and even some of the tunnels were built quite ornamentally and in a style probably beyond what was needed in order to instil confidence in the travellers of the time.
So how much of the original Hudson buildings left?
Almost all of the buildings remain now. In use as railway offices. The platforms are quite clearly visible. Part of the canopy, the overall roof, remains. There's the holes where In 1840 they built 2 archways through the city walls to get through towards the town centre and to build this very fine station.
Wouldn't even contemplate that today, would they?
No, it's quite unthinkable of destroying such an old structure in order to achieve this, but at that time probably people weren't too bothered about the walls.
So it's been railway offices ever since 1841, and even today your office is still here.
That's right, my office is in the station hotel that was built in the 1850s. But the main building here was opened in 1841, and the first board meeting recorded here was in very early 1841 in the room on the first floor. And that room is now actually the very heart of the control of Railtrack London North Eastern Zone, and perhaps could be said as achieving Hudson's vision because it's now controlling the whole of the route between London and Berwick.
As they said at the height of his fame, with his nods, men and gods keep in awe. When he winks, heaven shrinks. When he speaks, hell squeaks.
Well, you can certainly see the traits in his character which served him well in later life. He was the classic opportunist. He saw opportunities before other people had even seen them coming over the horizon, and he acted to make the best of them.
So what was it that started him off in the railways?
It's not particularly obvious why he seized upon the railway as the vehicle of his future and of the country's future, as he firmly believed. There's a theory which says that because he was a draper, he wanted to turn York into another version of the drapery capital of England, which was Leeds, and that a railway was essential to that. Whether that's the case or not, the evidence doesn't say, but there's no doubt he did seize upon the railway as the path to the future.
But it was really a meeting in Whitby with Stephenson that started the whole ball rolling.
It was the catalyst for Hudson turning to railways as his main focus of interest. And of course, it's an extraordinary story of chance. They simply happened to be in Whitby on holiday together, and they literally bumped into each other on the seafront. And it's from that meeting that the whole of the Hudson Railway Empire and the Railway King legend begins.
But if York was a monument to Hudson the Railway King, why was the station at Monk Wearmouth so grand?
Well, you know, Hudson was a very ambitious man. He had big commercial interests in these railways. He built this in such a grandiose fashion to celebrate his victory as an MP in the election of 1845.
Well, now some say Hudson was so arrogant and so, well, confident being kind, but really he was only reflecting the age, wasn't he, in his buildings and in his bridges?
Yes, he was. His stations and bridges are the great potent symbols of the development of the railway at that time.
I mean, it's extraordinary to think with high-level bridge over the Tyne in Newcastle, the wonder of its age in its day, but yet it was built only 25 years after the Stockton-Darlington opened.
That's right. Stephenson's design was quite innovative. It's a reflection, I think, in most years around at the end of the 1840s, at the speed of which the railway revolution was taking place.
But impressive as high-level bridge is, even to us today, it's only one of many, many monuments to that age throughout the whole region.
That's right. Our region is very fortunate in having quite a number of surviving monuments, perhaps none greater than Newcastle's Central Station. There's an example of one of the leading architects of the day, John Dobson, being utilised to add even more lustre to the power and the importance of the railway.
And it's a real statement to the absolute, complete confidence they had in themselves.
It is. The very scale of Central Station signifies the importance of the railway. It is massive. It's larger than any cathedral. It was utilising engineering technology which was innovative. Robert Stephenson was involved in the design of the roof. As I said, John Dobson was the overriding architect for the whole scheme.
Do you think we owe all that to George Hudson?
George Hudson's role was an important one, and as we've seen here at Monk Wearmouth Station, he left us something, a legacy, which is very impressive. But throughout the region, there were people who were getting involved in the railway development, the development of the railway. And they all had their role to play, and they were all keen to leave monuments to themselves and to the railway.
But at least George Hudson, as it were, set the ball rolling.
He certainly did, and standing here we can see what a fine job he did, at least at this station.
At the close of 1848, Hudson was at the height of his powers, at least on paper. There were 5,000 miles of railway, more than a third under Hudson's direct control. He'd spent a total of £30 million acquiring railways, but by now his sources of cash were drying up. After years of campaigning against him by the Times, the stockbrokers were able to show that Hudson had been cooking the books all along. He made a fatal mistake. He admitted it. York turned its back on him, and the wrath of the whole of Victorian England turned on him.
Ever since his fall, it's been conventional to condemn him as a swindler, as a crook, as a gambler. But we have to understand that he was existing in a very different political environment, a very different economic environment from the one we have today. The railways were the creation of free enterprise. He was operating within a free enterprise system which encouraged people to think of railways as essentially local concerns. He wasn't interested in local railways. He was interested in a unified national network, and he wanted to make that network work. The only way he could go about it was by using the free enterprise system of railway promotion as it existed at the time. But he had that vision, and I admire him for that vision, because this vision of a unified, centrally controlled network is essential to the efficient functioning of any modern transport system, and it's rather ironic that it's a vision we've lost sight of again very recently in this country.
So you admire him?
Yes, I think I do. It's an equivocal admiration, but yes, I think he was a man of great vision. I might not approve of many of his methods, but I do approve of that vision.
Could he exist these days, do you think?
He would not merely exist, he would flourish. He was a man who could make the best of any opportunity that came along. Whether he would actually be a positive force, I wouldn't like to say. I like to see him very much as a man of his time.
There's a statue outside which today says it's George Leeming, his arch rival. Tell me that story.
It is George Leeming, but only from the neck up. It was originally made as a statue of Hudson, but he fell from grace. This was in 1849, between the statue being made and it being put up. So what the citizens of York did was to, instead of making a new statue, they simply replaced the head with one of George Leeming.
So it's Hudson from the neck down?
It's Hudson from the neck down.
I mean, that's the ultimate insult, isn't it? Poor chap.
Well, you could say it's his sort of secret triumph. He's still there, standing in the city, which he very much made his own. Just because he happens to have someone else's head on is a minor matter.
It's much to George Hudson's credit that he never dragged any of his accomplices or hangers-on down with him. He took his comeuppance right on the chin. He sold everything to pay his debts and fled to France, where he lived the life of a pauper for 20 years. In 1868, he returned to Britain and died 3 years later, his body being brought back here to Scraingham, the village where he was born. Nobody's exactly certain where he lies in this quiet family plot, hiding his shame in death, as he did in the final years of his life. Do you know, it doesn't matter where you are in the country. If you're hungry, you can always rely upon fish and chips to come to the rescue. It's been the nation's Friday night favourite for well over a century. And who do we have to thank for it? The railways, of course. The middle decades of the 1800s saw an incredibly rapid spread of the network, called at the time railway mania. It was within a few short years possible to transport fish far inland within hours of it being caught on the coast. And the newspaper which it was wrapped in, well, it became possible wherever you were in the country to read papers on the same day that they were published. In every way, the railways brought our nation together.
And just as fresh fish found its way inland, so people began to find their way to the coast. A social revolution was underway. By the 1850s, barely 25 years after that first run on the Stockton and Darlington line, there were over 8,000 miles of railway in Britain. Time had to be standardised across the nation, and the main lines had sprouted branches which reached deep into the quiet backwaters of the country. Those who could afford it joined the exodus to the coast, and those with an eye on the main chance saw the opportunity to make their fortune.
It's funny how the same names crop up time and time again in the events surrounding the early years of the railway. Now the spotlight falls once again on the Pease family, only this time on Henry, the son of Edward Pease, who was one of the main backers of the Stockton to Darlington Railway. The story goes that in 1858, Henry was staying at Mask Hall, just a couple of miles down the coast towards Redcar. One Sunday morning, he came for a stroll along these cliff tops, and as his wife was later to relate, came to a stop more or less at this spot and had a vision of a celestial city with tall buildings all in white rising out of the cliff tops. And it was called Saltburn. Really and truly, if Saltburn started anywhere, Tony, it was here.
That's exactly right. This is the hub of the whole development of Saltburn. The railway was extended from Redcar, Saltburn by the Sea, and the first major building that was built was the Zetland Hotel alongside the railway station. The Zetland Hotel, of course, being the main attraction to bring visitors from far and wide throughout the country to visit this new resort.
And this was the private platform?
This was the private platform. Porters met every train that came in here and took their luggage and everything into the Zetland Hotel. If you imagine the situation, the train pulled into the station, which you can see through there, discharged the passengers who were going into the resort, and then the passengers due for the Zetland Hotel used to sit comfortably and patiently in their first-class compartments. The locomotive was loosed off at the front end, run round the back and push that compartment under this canopy that we're stood in, and the porters used to be waiting for those passengers to take the luggage, take them into the hotel and settle into the rooms that were allocated. Must have been a splendid sight to see that happen.
All hustle and bustle.
Yes.
So in every sense of the word, a resort created by the railways. So Henry's vision of a white celestial city, I mean, pull the other one, he was a businessman.
Well, he was a businessman who saw an outlet for his railway. For not only would that railway take iron ore away from the Upleathen mines and eventually be extended into East Cleveland, it would also bring a multitude of passengers of all sorts, because it was the age of the multi-transport. You know, plenty of people could travel on these new trains and travel anywhere they wanted to, at a cheap rate as well.
And the white aspect, Tony, there's more there than meets the eye as well, isn't there?
Oh yes, well the white bricks, of course, were manufactured by the Pease family. They had a colliery
Surprise, surprise.
Yes, well, why not? They had a colliery in County Durham, and one of the byproducts was in actual fact the white bricks. The fire bricks, really good bricks though, you can see how they've lasted over the years. Haven't eroded with the salt weather or anything like that. And of course, every one of those bricks were brought in by railway. So the railway was providing such a useful purpose all the time for everything that came into this town of Saltburn by the Sea. And it was so essential. That was the vision I see that he had this vision of using his railway to the maximum purpose, to take the iron ore back to the mills in Cleveland and everywhere else, and to bring in all the goods that the people that lived in the town that he was building needed.
The Zetland Hotel with its private station was completed in 1863. It was sumptuous for its day, with hot and cold running water on every floor. At first it stood in splendid isolation on the cliff top, but as the 1860s unfolded, the town sprang up all around. Pease's Saltburn Improvement Company spared no expense. Even today, the glory of its buildings is unfaded by nearly a century and a half. But if the Zetland Hotel was the new resort's crowning glory, then the Italian gardens were the jewels. When the cool sea breezes emptied the beach, then the gardens were the place to be. In the 1860s, 1,000 people a week would walk these paths at 6pence a time.
Well, these wonderful gardens actually were cribbed, I think, a little bit from Scarborough, I feel. Henry Pease and Thomas McNair went down to Scarborough to see how they handled the visitors, and one of the things that they saw there were the Italian gardens, and they got this particular garden created here, which I think has stood the test of time over many years. I think we just look at it now, it's in between flowers, but I think it's absolutely brilliant.
It's a remarkable survival.
Yes.
But of course, Saltburn by the Sea, we mustn't forget the sea.
No.
That was the main attraction.
That was the main attraction, was to bring people to the seaside. You then had an alternative when it was too cold to go on the beach. You could come into these warm gardens. It's lovely and warm here today.
It is.
Yes.
Warm enough for the beach.
Well, we're walking on a piece of history here, Andy. The blocks we're walking on were originally blocks on the horse-drawn wagonways in Durham and parts of the Darling-Stockton Railway. They became redundant because of the modernisation of the railways, and I think this is a real good example of recycling. They brought these away to Saltburn by the Sea, built the slipways and the promenades behind us with these blocks off the old wagonways and the Darling-Stockton Railway.
Because they become redundant, in fact.
Did become redundant. The horses walked down the middle of the old railway lines. Where they did away with horses and brought locomotives in, they could then span across the full width.
That's an amazing story, because you can still see the holes in some of these blocks,
Yes, that's right.
can't you?
In fact, some of them still show where the masons actually cut the shape of the chair out to settle the chair to the right level. And I think this is really history here. 140 years ago, 150 years ago, we've got it standing here now, being subject to all the wear and tear of the sea, still showing now.
So, Saltburn's at the top of the cliff, Tony. The promenade they built was down by the beach. Bearing in mind Victorian gentility, how did they solve the problem of getting people from the top?
And don't forget the crinoline skirts as well, Andy. But there was only down here, there was a rough bank down here, which was called the cart bank. And very quickly they realised they had to provide some mechanical means of getting these people down. And this was provided in the form of a hoist, which brought down 24 passengers at a time down to the low promenade level, and then they were able to promenade along our beautiful pier. It was wooden construction, and it operated those 13 years without a known accident, and then it was replaced by the inclined tramway, which we see today. The inclined tramway, of course, is a water-balanced tramway, still operating very much as it operated when it was designed, and it is the oldest operating water-balanced cliff tramway in the country. It is one of only 4 in the country. I think it is very special to Saltburn by the Sea.
And the other thing that's very special, you already mentioned, it's the pier, because I think it's the only surviving pier on the northeast coast.
Yes, it is the only surviving pier in the north of England, on the Yorkshire coast. There were several piers on the Yorkshire coast at one time. This pier has survived in time, and it is only a third of its original length, but nevertheless it is fighting for its survival, and we're fighting for its survival as well.
I mean, really, Tony, in every sense of the word, this is such a great testament to the Victorians and their railways.
Oh, I think so. I think the Victorians, bringing the railway to a place like Saltburn by the Sea, created Saltburn by the Sea, and here we have it today. We're 140 years on, and we have the town very much as the Victorians wanted us to have it. We've got the people in the sea, we've got the people walking the promenade, we've still got this wonderful pier here for people to walk on, we've got the cliff lift operating, and I think that really is a legacy that the Victorians left us and that we really do appreciate.
And of course we have the railways to thank for it all.
Well, the railways must be thanked for it all. We can be in London in 4.5 hours from Saltburn. We've been to the heart of Essex in 5.5 hours. And I think that's really, in this day and age, I think it's a great credit to the people that laid the foundations for all this.
Up until the 1860s, travelling by rail was quite an ordeal, even for those with a bit of brass. This coach was made in 1846 for the Stockton-Darlington Railway. Now, it's cramped, it's desperately uncomfortable, and it must have been bitterly cold in the winter. There's no heating whatsoever, and it would have been impossible to read anything by the dim light from the oil lamp in the roof. Worst of all, there were no lavatories. They say the stampede for the loos at every station was like witnessing the charge of the Light Brigade. By the 1870s, life was becoming positively luxurious for the travelling public. In 1873, lavatories had appeared for the very first time, and in the same year, sleeping cars were introduced. By 1879, you could eat a meal on a train, and by 1881, you could see what was on your plate because they'd introduced electric lights. And by the 1890s, the public were being positively pampered with steam heating.
By this time, travelling by train had received the royal stamp of approval. By the 1880s, a luxurious palace on wheels for the Queen, and for the rest, comfort undreamt of just a few years earlier.
So David, why did the companies suddenly improve comfort on the trains?
Well, one of the main reasons with this particular carriage that we're in now, which dates from 1898, was that you had two routes from London to Scotland. This was on the East Coast route, next to where the museum is here, but it was in direct competition with the West Coast route, which was run by different railway companies. There were races, in fact, for each the East Coast and the West Coast people to prove which was the fastest service. In actual fact, at the time, the West Coast route won, but the East Coast route, for which this carriage was built, made more of a virtue of being more comfortable and more scenic, which it is, of course. And so this is the result. And in fact, this design of carriage didn't really alter very much for the following 60 years.
As the century turned, these were the golden years for the railways. Motor cars were still unreliable bone shakers and as yet no real threat. There was no community in Britain which was more than 20 miles from a railway station. If commerce was Britain's lifeblood, then the railways were its veins and arteries. The railways played a vital role transporting troops and weapons to the front between 1914 and 1918 as Europe went to war yet again. 1923 saw the railways amalgamated into 4 great companies. Even today, their initials are still synonymous with the great and good old days.
You worked as a clerk from 1945, the end of the war, all around this area.
Yes, I did. I enjoyed it too. I worked on most of the branch lines because from Middlesbrough the area was very vast. So I worked from Whitby to Hawes and up into Durham and down almost into York. So it was a big area with a lot of branch lines.
I mean, really, I suppose you saw the very last golden days of the branch lines. What was life like?
Well, when you worked at a station, and perhaps you weren't there all the time, when you were on relief, you obviously were not there all the time, but people were part of the community. They were respected. A clerk was respected. The station master seemed to come along in the same category as the school teacher and maybe the doctor. But I enjoyed it because I was made to feel part of a very large business, which was profitable in those days.
Of course, you were a woman in a man's world as well, because weren't you just after the war?
Yes, indeed. The men were not yet back from the forces, and when they came back, they felt very strange in this, what to them would be an even more restricted atmosphere in the army. But I enjoyed it. I was well looked after. We issued day tickets for people to go on holiday. We issued week tickets for people to go on holiday. And when they came back, they often used to bring me a rock kipper and little presents. And sweets were still on ration then. And the early morning workman would often bring me a sweetie in the morning at 5 o'clock to keep me sweet for the rest of the shift, they used to say.
Of course, we mustn't forget there weren't too many cars around in those days. I mean, life really revolved around the train and the bike.
Yes, My bike used to go with me. I used to climb on the early morning train from Ormsby, which went at 4:23, and me and my bike used to go to Middlesbrough, where there were a lot of people about at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I used to take my bike along as far as Richmond, because when I came back, there often wasn't a train to get me home, so I used to cycle from Middlesbrough, but I was never afraid.
Because the branch lines and the stations were very much a part of local rural life then.
Very much so, because after all, the station master was the coalman, and so everything came to the railway. The stock came to the railway, the day-old chicks came to the railway, and he dealt with them, incoming and outgoing, breeding stock, all sorts of interesting things. And pigeons, of course, lots and lots of pigeons to be released at that particular moment. Not a moment before, a moment after.
Now, Stokesley was one of the stations you worked on as well.
Absolutely. There was a hatchery there, so we had a lot of day-old chicks. Well, they weren't so bad, but the growing stock were awfully smelly. Awfully smelly. Not to mention the fish. That was awfully smelly too and very wet. But Stokesley station was very interesting. I mean, you could get your hair cut in the signal box if you wanted. You know, if you weren't too particular, you get a short back sides for 4pence. That was often the case. Signalmen seemed to be very good at cutting hair.
I wonder why that was.
Perhaps they got time between trains.
Britain's railway network was at its greatest in 1930, when there were nearly 20,500 miles of line, the bulk of which were branch lines. One of those was the Wensleydale Railway through Leyburn, used until recently to transport stone. In its day, it was at the heart of everyday life in Leyburn.
So here we are, Arthur. That house behind. You were born there?
Yes, I was born in that house, March 11th, 1940. As I say, I was born there. I knew nothing else but trains when I was little. And there were some steps at the front of the house and a gate at the top. And you just stand on that gate all day and watch trains.
What was life like in those days?
It was very casual. It was casual, but everything ran smooth. Trains ran on time, everything was carried. People were happy with it.
What sort of things were the trains carrying there? Because I mean, there weren't many cars around those days.
Very few cars in them days. Livestock-wise, they carried everything from day-old chickens to elephants.
Elephants?
Yes, elephants. There was once a circus came to Leyburn. The elephants were bought by train, brought in vans, the doors at the ends, took them out and then walked them up through town to the circus. Because that was before my days.
Right. But yeah. I mean, that didn't happen every day either,
No,
did it?
no, that didn't happen every day, no.
So most days, what kind of freight were they carrying?
Well, sheep, cattle, horses from stables, and a lot of timber, an awful lot of timber went away from here. Stone from quarries, scrap, cattle food, everything in general.
I was going to say, what did the railway in those days mean to Leyburn and its people?
Well, it was a lifeline because shops relied on all their parcels and that came on passenger train, and they were taken up here, checked off in office, put into a wagon and delivered around town.
Do you miss those days?
Yes, oh yeah, it'd be nice for them to come back again.
Do you think they ever will?
Not to the extent that they were then. It'd be nice if they did, but not to that extent, I don't think.
Because looking at this station now, it doesn't look much like a station, shall we say, that's being kind. But in fact, it was one of the best kept stations in Yorkshire, wasn't it, or in North Yorkshire?
Yes, it was. You couldn't find a weed on this track anywhere. Right. And up there was a prize-winning garden up there.
Well, let's go and have a look at it, what's left of it anyway. So how busy a station was it when you were a lad?
Well, it was busy because it employed 39 altogether, from station master right down to plate layers. Somebody used to get up early morning to come and light engines up, a lighter up, and you know, that's how they started their career, to go on to locos and that.
So there were engines actually stationed
There was two. There was one to work passengers and a shunting engine stationed here. There was 3 drivers, 2 firemen and somebody to light up on a morning.
So economically it was really quite the heart of Leyburn.
Yes, it was, yeah, yeah.
Well now, there we are, Arthur. That's what's left of the prize-winning garden.
The prize-winning garden, yeah. It was a step up, a long lawn, and they once went down to the river at Leyburn and got nice big round stones and wrought labour in stones on the sloping lawn there. And further along towards the bridge, it was all rockery gardens. And like I said, they used to win first prizes with it. And also, it didn't include just the garden, it was the whole tidy station that they got the prizes for.
Do you feel a bit sad looking at it now?
Well, it's a sad sight now to what it was then. Yes, it is.
It must have seemed that the railways had reached their point of perfection and were beyond improvement, but it was not to be. Europe had gone to war again, and once more the railways rose to the occasion. But during those war years of 1939 to 45, they were badly neglected and starved of investment, and it meant that when peace was eventually restored, something drastic had to be done. In 1948, the Labour government nationalised the network, but there was something else fast catching up that was to wreak untold damage on the network. The internal combustion engine had arrived with a vengeance.
And the railways, what have we got there? Operated for more than 100 years without a break. Feeding a war machine for 6 weary years without adequate renewals and repairs that left them as tired as the rest of us. A wonderful but complicated heritage that could do with a bit of sorting out. They've taken over the whole chute, the nice bits and the awkward bits, from the level crossing down to the railway sandwich. And that was a heritage, if you like.
The 1st of January 1948, the newly born British Railways inherited 20,000 miles of track, 20,000 steam engines and well over 500,000 staff. The Labour Chancellor Hugh Dalton described it as a poor bag of assets.
Many people looking back still see 1948 as the beginning of the end.
Well, perhaps, but it was also, in another way, the beginning of something very, very different. Nationalisation wasn't just about bringing the railways into state ownership. It was also about creating, or trying to create, an integrated inland transport system, bringing the freight hauliers on the roads, the buses, the road coaches, the canals, the docks, the ports, the hotels, all of these together with the railways in one system that had never been tried before in quite that sort of way.
So do you think nationalisation was inevitable, bearing in mind that we were just recovering from war?
I think it was inevitable once the Labour government had come to power in 1945, yes. If the Conservatives had got in, I think it's less likely that nationalisation would have taken place. But in the end, I think the railways would have been nationalised. They were very run down after the war, needed huge levels of investment, and it seems unlikely that the private railway companies would have been able to get that money in the normal run of things after the war.
So did their fortunes improve after 1948, that the bad old days were over, there was no looking back?
Well, they didn't improve for a long time, and it was rather ironic, given that the railways had been nationalised in part in order that the state could invest in them, that for something like 10 years, really rather little was invested in the railways. And so they limped on with poor track and run-down locomotives and rolling stock, still moving huge numbers of passengers and huge tonnages of goods, but not really doing the job particularly well because the money wasn't there. The government said the money wasn't there to invest and turn the railway into a modern, efficient system.
In 1952, the railways returned a profit of £79 million. 4 years later, it was £17 million in the red. By 1961, the deficit was £87 million. In searching around for the reasons for such crippling losses, the Conservative government of the day turned on the branch lines. A new chairman was appointed for the British Transport Commission. His name still strikes a chill in the hearts of railway lovers today. But was Dr. Richard Beeching an axeman or a saviour?
Well, he certainly was an axeman, but he had to be an axeman in order to save the railways, I think.
Did he save the railways?
I think he did. I think the railways would have collapsed completely if somebody like that, of his calibre and ability, had not been put in charge.
I suppose in his defence, it's argued that Beeching's brief was only to make the railways pay and not take into account the social consequences. But these days, That's given him the epithet butcher.
Well, that may be, because of course the closure of the railways did have social effects, and I think his brief probably didn't pay sufficient attention to that. But that wasn't his fault, I think.
Beeching, of course, was a political appointee. When the Conservatives won the general election in 1959, they appointed a road engineering contractor, Ernest Marbles, as Minister of Transport. And I think everyone within the railway industry were very suspicious, apprehensive as to what was likely to happen. Because the Prime Minister at that time, Macmillan, said, well, the Gillibo report, which is a report that had been set up to examine the railwomen's rates of pay compared to other industries, and for the first time they got a reasonable offer. And of course, the Conservative government took the view that they could not be afforded. And that was part of the excuse for bringing in the cuts, the savage cuts that the Marbles and of course what I consider and most people consider to be his henchmen Beeching were going to bring about. But there was savagery and butchery.
Beeching's most damning report, The Reshaping of the Railways, was published in 1963. His brief was to return the railways to profit as quickly as possible, and he concluded that more than 5,000 miles of line and over 2,000 stations would have to go. It's said the picture he painted was of parasitic branch lines sucking the lifeblood out of the rest of the system.
People don't understand. There was one case, for example, in Wales. There was a branch line which we decided should be closed. I should say that I was very closely involved with the Beeching report. And there were about 380 people had travelled on it. There were 6,000 signatures for it to be kept open. People wanted it just in case they had to use it.
You worked very closely with Dr. Beeching, and indeed you had a hand in writing the report, The Reshaping of the Railways. Were you aware at the time of how crucial it was?
Oh, yes. And in fact, I wrote a long piece, which I think is some 30 pages long, of how we should present this report to the public. Because it could be, and indeed was in many cases, misunderstood. So obviously I didn't do a very good job of work.
The criticisms are that there were lots of dirty tricks going on at the time to justify branch line closures.
That's not true. There was nothing like that at all. People who worked over 2 years on this report were honest and good people. There was nothing like that whatsoever, I assure you.
No dirty tricks?
None at all.
Repairs were not carried out, and on some places where repairs weren't necessary, work was done to increase the cost. But the main things that needed to be done were left. So that at the end of the day someone would come along and have a look and say, well, to continue to keep this branch line open requires X amount of money. Well, there isn't sufficient volume of traffic on that line, it can be closed. And of course the speed at which closures went through was frightening.
This is all that's left of one of the most famous railway lines in Britain. The Stainmore line once ran westwards from County Durham into Cumbria, carrying mainly mineral traffic. It closed to passengers in 1962, exactly 100 years after it opened. But why did Britain allow this line and scores of others like it to close, against the will of the local authorities, against the will of the majority of the press and public, and against the will of the unions?
Well, there was plenty of activity at the local level, but it seemed to fall apart when it got to the national level. I believe that the main cause of that was that the General Secretary at that time, Sir Green, who's now Lord Green, must have looked at the Beeching proposals and come to the view that, yes, there were going to be closures. But his main concern was on the closures of the railway workshops. He saw large areas, villages, communities going to be destroyed, and he concentrated his efforts on the retention of the workshops. When he realised that that was going to fail, he looked for a redundancy agreement to try and get as good a redundancy agreement as possible. He was also motivated with the thought that when the railways become profitable under the Beeching proposals, then the railwaymen, those who are left in the industry, will be an elite force, the highest paid people within the country. That unfortunately never came to pass.
Looking back, do you feel bitter about it?
Very bitter. The viewpoint really is that they were families, generations being in the railway industry, and they were being destroyed unnecessarily. The morale within the industry, it was always high, but from that day on, from the realisation that there was not going to be a fight, there must have been tacit resistance, but no real fight. They began to want to leave the industry, an industry which they had been born into and wanted to remain in and bring their children into. They wanted to get out as quick as they possibly could.
But the greatest villain, most now agree, was the increasingly powerful road lobby. Ernest Marples, Transport Minister in the 1959-64 Conservative government, was a road contractor, and Frank Cousins in Wilson's cabinet of 1964 had strong links with the Transport Union, most of whose members earned their livelihoods on the roads. But did the supporters of road transport have far too much influence over the instructions Dr. Beeching was given?
Well, I took the view that he was carrying out the duties and responsibilities that had been given to him by the Minister of Transport, Ernest Marples. Because in response to a question which I did ask, he said that given a different remit, I would have come up with a different proposal. So I took the view that, yes, if he'd been asked to do something differently, to provide a workable, viable railway, he could have produced one.
And would have?
And would have.
It's much to Richard Beeching's credit that when, in early '65, he was asked to look at Britain's transport system as a whole, he chose to bow out rather than be influenced by road supporters yet again.
Well, he'd been asked by Harold Wilson, who was Prime Minister, to do a survey of transport, an overall survey of road, rail and air transport, and he'd agreed. Then he was sent for by Harold Wilson again, and he said he wanted Frank Cousins to sit looking over Beeching's shoulder, and Beeching said no. I was waiting to see him at 222 Marylebone Road, which is the Railways Board headquarters, when he came back. And he said, "What do you want, Eric?" And I said, "Oh, well, come with me, I'm going to the ministry." And on the way to the ministry to see Barbara Castle, he told me what had happened, that he'd refused to do this job, and he went and resigned there and then from British Railways.
Was he aware that among certain people he was a villain?
I'm certain he knew very well that in certain parts the Beeching report would not be happily received, but he thought it was the best thing for railways.
And he was still convinced of that right to the very end?
Oh yes, right to the very end.
Today, many still argue that some of Beeching's evidence for closure was flimsy, to say the very least, and that were it to come to public inquiry these days would be discredited and totally rejected. It's a matter of great sadness and of great shame that 40 years on, when we so desperately need some of our branch lines back, that their bridges, their embankments, their cuttings and their stations, like this one at Bowes, have been destroyed. By the late 1960s, Dr. Beeching's job was done. Britain had lost over 5,500 miles of railway line. In many cases, the local bus services simply were not up to the job, and villages were left to fend for themselves. But in a few notable places, the local communities were not going to take defeat lying down. Here on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, a group of local people managed to score a rare victory over the Axemen. The line closed in '65. Why did you decide to save it?
I'd known and loved this line since I was a boy in the 1930s, in LNER days. It was beautiful, historic and scenic, and in my view served a social purpose.
But it was such a formidable task, wasn't it?
It was very formidable, but I had a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and faith.
But why? Why the passion?
Hard to say, but I just felt it was something that I wanted to do, even if I gave up part of my life to it.
Which you did. You devoted a fair slice of the years in the 60s and 70s to it.
6 years of nothing much else besides my work and my family.
What about other support though, Tom? How did you find that?
Well, before our first meeting in June 1967, I had spoken and talked this over with a number of people, some of the practical railway men, who I knew were interested, and before we called the first meeting, I had in my mind a core of people who would help.
I mean, you had literally nothing. There was half a dozen of you at that very first meeting. I think Rossop, wasn't it?
Yes.
You had nothing. You had no money, just a lot of faith.
Well, we started absolutely from scratch. You say no money. Well, we thought it was great when one of our founder members offered an interest-free loan of £1,000. We thought that was big money then.
But it did pump prime. It did, get things moving.
Yes, we as soon as we got brochures and posters printed, we started getting them stuck up in shops. And I remember doing some personal canvassing in Goathland before we even had a brochure. And I went to one elderly lady to ask her if she would join, and she was so worried about my bona fide status quo that she went next door but one to a legal advisor and asked if it was all right to pay her 10 shillings.
And you did survive those early years on the 10 shillings and on the pounds and
yeah, we started fundraising pretty well straight away, running whist drives and raffles, sponsored walks, jumble sales. Charlie Hart became our fundraiser and he's still involved now.
Guy to the line, 180. Go. Much obliged. We thought we were going to save about 3 miles of track and get a little engine and 2 or 3 coaches. We've ended up with 18 miles, second biggest in the country. And
do you feel proud?
Yeah, very much so. More than we'd ever dreamt. It's more than we ever dreamt. I mean, when you've got big engines like this, you draw the people in you, and of course you've got to keep drawing the people in.
We did anything to raise money, and I remember our publicity officer, John Tyndale, organised a concert on the lines of the good old days at Whitby Spa, and the theatre was filled and it made quite a lot of money. But canvassing for membership was very important, and the membership money that came in did help an awful lot.
You finally achieved your goal. It must have been a wonderful day in 1973.
Yes, when the Duchess of Kent came up and the line was reopened. It was quite splendid.
How did you feel that day, apart from exhausted?
A bit deflated. It was all over.
But the original plan was only to run as far as Goathland from Gromont, wasn't it?
The agreement we got in 1968 was for the land and buildings as far as Levisham, which was 12 miles, and the track to Ellerbeck, which was about 6 miles. And if we could, we intended to relay the rest in stages. But really, it was always Gromont Pickering was the goal. And it was through that and the insistence on Gromont Pickering that British Rail left the track down for us. We kept on all the time on top of them, and the track wasn't lifted. And then in the end the county council and the tourist board and other people came in with the big guns, and that saw us through to Pickering.
What do you think of it now? What do you feel coming back here?
Well, I feel very, very pleased. I mean, the line is still there, which was my great ambition. If you go along the top of the moors, you can see the line running through Newtondale. Very romantic railway, I always thought it was, disappearing down into Newtondale there. And it gives me a lot of satisfaction.
Do you also feel you're one of the few people that perhaps beat beaching?
Yes, I'm very pleased about that. I hated the beaching plan. Very pleased that I could do something about it.
In 1973, the North Yorkshire Moors Railway made a loss of £8,000 and carried 80,000 passengers. Last year it turned in a profit of £121,000 and carried 275,000 people. Its running costs in those years rose from £19,000 to over £2 million today. But the North Yorkshire Moors Railway is no giant plaything. Since 1973, Tom Salmon's passion and enthusiasm has been turned into hard-headed economics.
Ken, what is the railway? Is it a tourist attraction? Does it have a social conscience? Is it a business?
Well, I believe it's all of those things. Certainly it does have a social conscience, and that was one of the reasons why it first existed. Secondly, it does exist as a tourist attraction because running through the national parks, it does attract quite a number of tourists, and we are involved in taking quite a number of cars off the road in an environmentally sensitive area. But underlining all of that, it does have to exist as a business. It doesn't receive any public funding at all, so what we earn we have to make sure that we retain, and so it is run on sound business lines.
Do you not have a sort of a romantic side of you which likes playing with trains?
I must admit that that side of it, it doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned, I will be honest. I am interested in developing the railway as a business, and that is what, in a sense, one of my major roles is, to ensure that the business of the North Yorkshire Moors Railway is successful, and it will be here for many, many years to come, so that people can enjoy the railway in whatever shape or form they choose.
What about future plans, though? I mean, are you planning to extend the railway?
Yes, absolutely. We plan to develop the railway and to extend it. Over the years, the railway has developed in terms of passenger services, in terms of facilities, and we'd like to see that continue throughout the existing railway as it stands now. But I do firmly believe that we ought to consider seriously expanding the services into Whitby.
But generally speaking, do you think railways have a future in England, in Britain?
Oh, absolutely. I believe that railways have a very sound future in Britain. It has been proved on the continent the part that railways play in transportation, and I'm sure that various lessons that have been learnt on the continent can be followed through here. So yes, I firmly believe that railways have a definite future as far as the UK and Britain is concerned.
So would you say that 40 years on we're only just putting right the damage that Beeching did?
40 years on, I think we are reinventing railways and we're going in the right direction.
Steam came to an end in 1968. The day of the diesel-electric had arrived. Over the years, the road transport lobby had been gathering strength. They'd been pressing for higher speeds for lorries and for the building of more motorways. By 1959, the motorway construction programme was unstoppable.
Many would argue that the greatest damage done to the railways since the 60s came from this revolutionary little car and its imitators and successors. The Mini, which also appeared in 1959, was both manoeuvrable in town and nippy on the new motorways. And like David taking on Goliath, the railways simply could not compete. The trickle of passengers deserting the train for the car turned into a flood. We've all of us felt the desperate frustrations of trying to travel on our busy roads and motorways these days. The car has become truly a victim of its own success. But what can we do about it? Is an old and much neglected friend about to come to the rescue? More people have died on Britain's roads since 1945 than were killed in the Second World War. At present, 3,500 lose their lives on our highways each year. In 1991, a survey compared Europe's small towns with similar-sized communities in Britain. In Germany and France, the number of towns with no rail or bus services was below 10%. In Britain, it was 46%. With congestion increasing all the time and gridlocks becoming more and more frequent, is it time we renewed our acquaintance with an old and much neglected friend? This grassy track was once a railway line. For more than 100 years, it was Wensleydale's link with the outside world, connecting the East Coast Main Line at Northallerton with the Settle to Carlisle line at Garsdale Head. It was ripped up 40 years ago. But if a group of local people have their way, reports of its death have been very much exaggerated.
Wensleydale is one of North Yorkshire's top tourist honeypots. In summer, its roads are choked with sightseers' cars. In 1990, some concerned local people formed the Wensleydale Railway Association with the seemingly impossible task of restoring the long-lost line.
So Scott, when will this railway come back to life?
Well, I think to an extent it already has. We've been involved with trying to reinstate this railway for good, solid economic reasons now for some time. And we're really at the stage now where we're ready to push ahead and get the trains back here as soon as we can resolve all the necessary land issues.
It was closed, what, some 40 odd years ago to freight anyway?
It was closed to passenger services in 1954 and the track was lifted in 1964.
Well, that was 40 years ago, but what makes you think these days that there's a difference, that you can make it pay?
Well, we've got two markets in Wensleydale. There's the tourists in the summer that are making the place unpleasant for residents and are choking up the roads. We know we can get them onto the trains because the railway follows the kind of route that the car drivers want to do. And also there's the local people. Over 30% of people in this area don't have access to a car at times, and they're trapped at the moment. By providing the kind of services people want to go to work, to shops, to visit people at the times they want, we're confident we can get traffic onto the railway.
You have very concrete, firm plans to bring the line here to Aysgarth as a first step. I mean, that seems to be well advanced now. But I mean, how realistic, hand on heart, is it going to be to restore the whole line to Garsdale? Because it's a dickens of a task.
It's a long project, there's no question about that. And we need to be sensitive of all the issues regarding going through the national park. When the line was closed, it was sold off to over 50 different owners. Each one of those has got their own needs for the trackbed and their own points of view on it, and we need to work carefully with that. That's going to be really the thing that dictates the timescale on it, and it has done up until now. In terms of the project's viability, that doesn't seem to be a problem. The trackbed's in very good condition, the majority of the structures are still there, and mercifully none of it's been built on, and we know that there's a demand for the services.
A huge plus for the association is the fact that the line still exists between Northallerton and Redmire. It was used by British Steel to carry limestone out for their furnaces, and over the years, special trains for enthusiasts have put in rare appearances. But in 1992, limestone trains were withdrawn, and it was feared the rails would be lifted. Quite unexpectedly, the army saved the day.
So why did the army decide to take on this railway line?
Well, it went back to the early 90s when it was decided that Catterick was going to be expanded quite considerably. And whenever there's an expansion taking place somewhere, an environmental impact assessment is done. And the one done at that time was really very extensive indeed. One of the issues that came out of it was to try and alleviate the movement of military traffic in the local area, to try and make sure that we weren't going to overload the public roads, not least with the sort of the villages nearby. And the village which had been affected most was Catterick village down on the A1. And I'm not quite sure exactly how they came to the conclusion, but they were saying, well, we ought to try and do something by train. And coincidentally, here was a project which would suit both us and the local community, and indeed almost national interests.
So really it was a bit of a gift for you?
Well, it was, except it cost the Ministry of Defence £750,000 to do up the rails. That was our sole investment, and this concrete apron here.
So, I mean, would you say that you've helped the Wensleydale Railway Association? Is it a major leg up for them in their plans to reopen the line all the way to Garsdale?
Oh, I think it has been, because that initial investment really brought the thing back into use and made it safe and usable. We, of course, don't actually use it that much, but it is there for us to use if we need to.
So, misty-eyed optimism or hard-headed economics. But whatever you think of the plans at Wensleydale, by no means are they alone. Here at Alnwick, a group of local people are thinking along the same lines. Pardon the pun. They want to reopen the 3 miles of their old branch line from the old town station here down to the existing East Coast mainline station at Alnmouth for both tourists and commuters. Now, you and your wife own this bookshop, Stuart, but can it be turned back into a railway station?
I think so, because the bookshop only takes a quarter of the station, and there's an awful lot of station left for the railway and other things too.
Realistically though, Stuart, hand on heart, do you honestly see a future for a 3-mile branch line from Alnwick to Alnmouth?
Well, obviously we do, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it, but the special reasons for believing in its credibility is a complete branch line and has a mainline connection at Alnmouth. The general view with heritage railways is that you can have some very attractive long ones, but by and large they attract the enthusiast, whereas the shorter ones frankly attract the tourist. They don't actually want to travel 20 miles on a steam train. 6 miles, 3 miles there and back does nicely, thank you very much. And we believe it's certainly very sound from the commercial aspect.
Now, the railway closed in 1968, which is more than 30 years ago. How did it all start, this idea to get it reopened again?
Well, a local councillor nobbled me and said, how about lottery money? As a businessman, I did appreciate it would be very expensive to reopen this line, and it wasn't until someone said to me, hey, go for the lottery, I thought, well, perhaps there might be a viable way. Now, with any funding like that, you must raise a lot of the money yourself, but we conceived the idea, if the lottery could fund half the railway, we could find the other half, and we spent the next 3 years trying to find that other half, and the other funding, possibly including lottery, is still in formation and looking very promising.
What about, I mean, you've got a formidable task in front of you, only 3 miles, but has not the line been built over in parts?
By and large, there's only one area where there's been any building over it, and that's a small industrial estate, which it can thread its way through, and actually with the movement of one factory unit alone, it is possible to reach it. Luckily, there's been no big housing estate over it, but formidably, there are 2 bridges to be rebuilt, and that is really the main focus of the fundraising exercise. Without the bridges, we have no railway.
Are you broadly getting a lot of support from people of Alnwick?
Well, the scheme started off obviously with enthusiasts giving it support, and we had the Duke as president and Alan Beath as vice president. So we got a good figurehead start and a good launch in that way. And the people of Alnwick largely probably didn't care one way or the other, mostly. But when we got the rail companies involved and people could see that a commuter service might come out of this as well as a tourist railway, the whole situation changed, and we now believe we have a very solid support from the people by and large in the area.
How do you mean the railway companies involved?
Railtrack, Northern Spirit and Great North Eastern Railway have all promised support to the project in various ways. Now, as Railtrack owned the Alnmouth site, it was vital that we at least had their cooperation. What was unexpected was their reasonable enthusiasm for the scheme. They're very keen for it to happen, and Northern Spirit are very keen to run the rail service in between the tourist trains.
The task in Weardale is a good deal simpler, thanks to the cement works which only recently stopped using the line. When all is signed, sealed and delivered, The Weardale Railway wants to run 6 services a day between Darlington and Stanhope. Managing Director Brian Morris expects it'll start paying for itself 3 years after reopening.
Why decide to reopen a long, redundant railway line?
Because we believe this is an asset to Weardale. We're fortunate that it hadn't been uplifted. We think it's of value to the community of Weardale, and we believe that our service will be a valuable one.
I suppose most people would look at it and say, well, you're going to do another North York Moors Railway. It's going to be a tourist attraction.
No, it's not a tourist attraction, and it is not for people that want to play trains. It is a proper working railway, which is a public service. It's a 12 months a year railway, and it will operate from early morning until late evening. It will, of course, provide an attraction for tourists during the season because we propose to run occasional steam specials.
Those are just 3 of the schemes to reopen rural branch lines, but what of the long-term future? As the new millennium unfolds, are we about to witness a major change in the way we all live, every bit as far-reaching as that which revolutionised Victorian society and the rest of the world? And once again, will the railways be called upon to play a key role?
Welcome to the future, at least as far as Germany sees it. This is Maglev, a train which uses magnets to hover just a few centimetres above the track and others to push it forwards at speeds of up to 250 miles an hour. This is no science fiction, it's science fact. The principle of magnetic levitation and propulsion was invented in Britain, but the idea was taken up by Germany. There had been plans for a superfast service 162 miles between Hamburg and Berlin, but the German government has now scrapped the £3.5 billion project, preferring instead to look at shorter routes where more passengers are likely. But Germany's not alone in its vision of the future. The Chinese are also looking at Maglev to take them into the 21st century.
Do you think we're going to see 300, 400, 500 mile an hour trains?
I suspect we are, yes. This is something that railways potentially can do very well. Very fast interurban transit, moving people from city to city at very high speed. This is the way lots of new developments in railway technology are going, and I'm sure it's something we're going to see.
I think in 20, 25 years, I don't think we will see that, because I'm not sure that we have got the land, take and everything else to build high-speed railways in the way the French and the Germans have done. I think what you'll see is where we're currently 2 tracks, we'll go to 4 tracks. So the 2 in the middle are for fast trains at 140, 150 miles an hour. Whether we get to 200, I don't know.
But whatever benefits new technology will bestow on our children and grandchildren, in order for railways to take us into the 21st century, we have to look at them in a new light.
Platform 5, 11:33 GNR service to London King's Cross.
And encouragingly, that seems to be already happening.
Well, there's very much a difference in attitude. We have an awful lot of young people travelling on trains. Our age profile is very much the under 40s. And it's perhaps because the generation before that, they were the people who bought their first cars in the 50s and the 60s and didn't really think anything about rail. But now it's a very much an accepted way of transport.
Well, today I was very impressed because it was on time and it was very fast and it was quite good value, I thought. So generally, when it's on time, it's great.
Would you prefer to travel by train or car?
Train. It's much less hassle. It's very nice. I got out my marking and did all my marking, and I had a cup of coffee, looked out the window.
Well, it's just the traffic, it's just so uncertain. I mean, usually with the trains, they do run on time, and today it's been very good, and I've got here much faster than I probably would had I taken the car.
It's easier than taking a bus or renting a car or something.
Because you come from a country which, shall I say, worships the motor car.
Oh,
definitely.
You can't get anywhere on public transportation at home. It's very difficult, and one of the advantages of traveling here is you don't have to rent a car, you don't have to know how to drive on the left side of the road.
Do you have a car?
Yes, I do.
Which do you prefer to use?
A train. It's much more, well, it's more convenient, a lot easier to sort of travel around, find your feet. You don't have to sort of bother with parking spaces, etc.
I think it's more economical, and I think a lot more of the younger generation are more aware of the environment and what they ought to be doing to protect it.
You can sit and relax, can't you?
Yeah,
You can have a chat and a cuppa in the magazine.
A cuppa?
No, I love travelling by train.
Why?
The comfort, just sitting back, not having to watch the rest of the traffic. You know.
Because I guess when you started driving a car,
Oh,
the
now
roads
then.
were a lot different, weren't they? I mean, they were quieter,
A
weren't they?
long time ago, yes, yes.
I think we've seen this enormous growth in passenger numbers. When the railways got franchised, privatised, it was all done on the basis the railways weren't going anywhere. Railtrack, when it got privatised, was done on the basis there was going to be no passenger growth. Nobody expected this growth in freight. Nobody expected this growth in passenger numbers. Yet we've had this phenomenal growth, so it is going terribly well.
Why?
I don't think any of us actually know is probably the answer. The economy's done well. There's no doubt that fares being held back below inflation, whereas historically fares went up well ahead of inflation, so every time demand went up, prices went up to choke off demand. I think we've actually got the service right on a lot of services, train companies, generally across the country. People do say it's getting better. I know there are problems about punctuality, but overall the thing is getting better. There are a lot more innovative price offers around in getting people to travel. And of course, road congestion gets worse and worse, so things are moving in rail's favour at the moment.
But it's not just people who are returning to the railways. The days of the motorway juggernaut may be numbered. All the signs are that freight is also switching to rail.
Rail freight has had a steady decline over the 60s and the 70s and was perhaps only in the core long distance heavy freight market. It's now perhaps a bit like the passenger market, developing into new fields, into the distribution of materials, goods. Even the supermarket chains are now starting to come back to rail freight.
I think we will see the development of fast passenger lines with freight running on different routes. I think we will get away from this idea of mixing heavy, big, successful long freight trains with fast intercity passenger trains. We will see in that time the tilt trains coming in. We will see an enormous investment by Railtrack to create this capacity on the route. You will see the development of parkway stations besides motorways to get the motorist out of his car, pour the motorist gently from their car onto the train. You'll see big investment in stations. I mean, our stations are magnificent buildings. The Victorians built these wonderful stations, but we've let them go down, whereas you've seen now Paddington looks fantastic, Liverpool Street looks fantastic, Newcastle is being rebuilt, York needs escalators. We can really make these stations really live and become much more friendly, welcoming places, the sort of the airport on the railway, because that's what it ought to be. So you're going to see all that going on as well, I think.
So do you think we're on the brink of a second golden age for the railways?
I think we're already there. We're already over the brink. We're in the beginnings of that golden age for the railways. We now have the Channel Tunnel. We have new high-speed rail developments in North America, in Japan, even in Africa. People are looking to the railways to solve transport problems. There's certain things that only the railways can do, that railways do much better than any other form of transport, and more they're going to perform that role.
Do you see it then, as the millennium turns, us putting right the mistakes that were made 40, 50, 60 years ago with our railways?
Yes, I think we are. I think we're going back to one of your earlier programmes, the golden era, when you did see this great development of railways and massive investment going on in the before the First World War and after the First World War, and I see that really as coming back to what we're doing. The money becoming available to invest in the railways to really raise them back to the levels and standards that they should be.
We've come a long way in 400 years, and yet new chapters are still being written in our railway story. The North East gave the railways to the world. The big question is now, what will the world do with the railways? As we've seen, many countries are developing super fast trains, and it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that our grandchildren will one day be able to travel between Newcastle and York at several hundred miles an hour. Next stop, the 21st century.